Hi everybody, this is Armand. Today we're going to take care of installing camshafts on this 2.5 liter swapped NC Miata. Several of you have asked for a video of how to do this in engine bay, so here we are. So today, this car already has the battery relocated. It has a cold air intake, so we'll have a little less obstruction here. We're going to start by taking apart everything it takes in order to get the front cover off, as well as to get the valve cover off. So that'll be the hood for ease of access, because we're going to be working on top of the engine in order to install valve springs. We're going to take off all of that stuff back there, the bracing, the air intake elbow. We're going to have to dislocate the alternator because it is, well, sort of in the way. And then the tensioner, the pulleys, and the power steering pump. And then over here, let's just run over all the parts I've got. New valve cover gasket, new VVT gasket, front main seal, crank bolt, crank washers, cam bolts, cam washers, valve springs, Esslinger stage 2 cams, along with their shims. These are the little Lash caps, and then the assembly lube, of course. Our trusty crank holder tool, and then of course a massive speeds performance timing kit. This guy is handy. This is just an organizer to hold together all of the stuff as I take it apart and keep it in order. And then down here we have our valve spring compressor tool. This is the style that we're going to be using in order to do this without taking the head off of the engine. And then we have our leak down tester, which we're not actually testing leak down. We're going to use that to pressure up the cylinder in order to hold the valves up while we take the springs out. Oh, and then they must have a caulking tube full of RTV. So, be honest with yourself, if you are not comfortable with timing a motor, this is not the motor to learn on. I do have another video on how to assemble these motors outside of the car, as well as time them and everything, and that is significantly easier. But today we're doing the hard mode because the previous owner of this car didn't want cams at the time of assembly of the car, and the new owner does. He wants cams now, so we're going to cam it. I'm not going to do step by step on this. I'll be doing it just sort of jumping through, so in the next frame, this engine base should be disassembled to the level that I stated. Ta-da! So we got all that stuff apart. A couple of notes. You need to be very careful up here. This is an AC line, is under pressure. If you happen to jiggle it too much, that joint over there is solid, so it will just spray out AC all over the place. These lines aren't as strong as you may think. Just because they're made out of aluminum doesn't mean they're strong. They're an extremely thin aluminum and you will break them. So the heater line is flexible, however, so if you disconnect this little clip here, get all those 10mm bolts to pull out the cowl brace, then you'll be able to wiggle this just enough to get the cowl brace out. Now down on the front side, we have removed the crank angle sensor, we have removed out the tensioner, we have, let's see, the pulley that was right here. There are 3 main 13s right here and 1 down here next to the AC compressor. Obviously the belt's removed, this pulley's removed. The rest of the bolts on the front of the timing cover are all 8s. And then there are 2 in the center. There's 1 here and there's 1 behind the crank pulley. So in order to get the crank pulley out, this has a progress sway bar in here, so it's way thick. There's no way we can actually get a tool in here to actually remove the crank bolt. So what we're going to do is we're going to get under here, loosen up the sway bar mounting bolts so we can pull it back a little bit, get our giant breaker bar in there and break this loose. I have went ahead and loosened all of the bolts out of the valve cover so we can take that off when we're ready. The ECU is removed. The power steering pump is obviously hanging over here to the side along with the tank. So we have all this room to work right here. So we should have all the room we need in order to get the cover off and up, and then as well as back in without getting RTV all over the place. I've relieved the sway bar now. I pulled all of the nuts holding on the bracket, but I also, because of how big the progress bar is, I went ahead and dropped the lower radiator mount so I could swing the radiator down, and that allows the bar to move even farther. So notice, the bar is barely even visible now because there's now a ton of room in here. That'll be great. So what we'd like to do now is put this thing at either before or after top dead center. Doesn't matter what cycle because we're pulling the cams out. So right now the crank locator bolt is on the bottom, so that means we are at a TDC right now for cylinder 1. So I'm just going to rotate it about 90 degrees And then what we can also do is you can just grab one of your long extensions and verify. I have also pulled the spark plugs. So, oop, not that one. That's the one. We drop this in here. We're at TDC. That one's definitely at BDC. So we're gonna rotate this thing to where this goes down just enough. And it doesn't need to be exact 90, but close to 90 is good. We're just trying to get all the pistons at the low, or at the midpoint, so they are all at the lowest point that they can be simultaneously. So we don't have any piston to valve problems while we try to remove these cams or spin them over. This will also help us when we go to install our new cams, because we're gonna need to spin those over and make sure that we can check our lash without having any P2V problems. So, got out my long snap-on with the 21 on the end, and I have just a 1/2-inch breaker with our fancy tool on there. It's like I grabbed the wrong 21. I meant to grab the short one. But we have our tool on there. We've rotated the crank over 90 degrees. So we're going to be reinforcing this direction. I'm grabbing this guy, sliding it down in there. This is difficult to do while holding a camera. And we're going to pull these apart. So let's see if I can do this with the camera. Okay, the bolt is now loose. Once it's loose, we don't need this tool anymore. You can go ahead and get this out of here. You can drop it in the engine bay if you want, that's fine. So we'll just stick our broken glove hand down there and spin that out of there. And once this is out, we're going to pull the crank pulley off, and then we can get the remainder of the bolts off of the bottom of the front cover. I have removed just about all of them around the left and right side. So this will just spin or pull right off of here. Uh-oh, looks like I'm hitting a power steering line. So we may need to push that over just a little bit, or we can also get a jack and put it under the oil pan and lift up the motor just a little bit. It was actually just at the last millimeter, so I bent that line but just a little bit and it fell right off. So there's our crank pulley. That's the locator hole that we're going to need for later. And we're going to grab those bottom 4/8 off of here. If you're working on a 2-liter, you're really going to hate yourself, because for some reason Mazda decided to put studded bolts on the bottom, so those are just a little more difficult to get out. But nonetheless, we need to get those 4 out of there. There is the one that was behind the crank pulley. That actually, on the 2.5s, this is positioned nicely, so you can actually get it out from between the teeth on, or the spokes on this. Personally, it doesn't matter to me, because of course we're pulling it off, we're going to get those. Okay, that's actually a note for later. When you're reassembling, you actually don't need to torque. You're not supposed to torque down everything while the RTV is setting. However, you can actually torque down the crank pulley and then later torque down all of the front cover bolts, because you do have access to that one bolt. We probably won't do that though, because those lower bolts are very difficult to get to after you have the crank pulley in. So now I'm going to go ahead and clean up everything up here. I'm going to get the front cover off after I get those 4 bolts, and then we'll resume. And the way you remove it now is you just stick the pry right here and pry it right off. That's it. So we'll just need to bring it a little bit forward to get it off of the crank pulley, and then come right out. Ta-da! Now we're going to have to clean that up, as well as clean off the front of the motor. I'm going to save the cleaning of the front of the motor for after we get the cam stuff out. But now that we're at this position, it's actually pretty easy. If you just want to put a Crescent, these are Crescent brand, stick that guy on there, hold this, blast those 2 off with an impact. That'll just save you a little bit of time and effort. But for assembly, we'll end up actually torquing those and marking them. Okay, let's see, we will be removing the oil chain. We are able to roll that off without actually removing the 10 down there. You just have to remove off the tensioning assembly, so we can replace off the diamond washer behind it. But we just want to make sure that we can clean off the whole face of this motor really nicely before we reassemble. Okay, so I'm going to show you what I've gotten apart now. Got all the timing components off. Like I said, as long as you remove out the tensioner and the bolt that holds the spring for the oil pump gear, chain, you can get that just rolled off. You need to get the chain towards the rear and roll the gear forward, and it'll pop right off. Let's see, so I got the other chains off. Let's see, all the bolts that you remove, let's see, these 2 bolts, throw them away. If there are washers behind them, on some motors there are, throw those away. Same with the crank gear. The bolt needs to be thrown away, and if there are washers on it, those need to be thrown away. We have brand new ones because these are torque to yield, and these are torque to yield. And then of course these aren't crush washers, but they are diamond washers. When these set, you don't want to reuse them. So our next objective after lunch, we'll get the cams out. We'll just blast off all of those bolts, pull the cams. We're going to take out all the buckets. We don't have to put them in the organizer, but we will, just so we have a note of where everything is for reassembly. And then we're going to do the calculation on shims after, or on clearances after we get all those valve springs installed. Those are all the Mazda speed valve springs. Just remove the camshafts. Just with this one, you have to start out with the front piece right here, as well as remove the VVT actuator. On some of them you don't. It depends on the type of assembly they are. This one has the skinny VVT actuator. If you read my instructions that I wrote up and published on the internet, it measures the diameter of this. This is the skinnier one, where the VVT actuator points towards the rear. The fatter shaped one points towards the front, and that's actually the one that comes on the OEM 2.0 liter and very few of the 2.5s. So yeah, remove this guy, get it out of the way, and then you remove this, you remove all of those, and I went ahead and took the liberty of removing the buckets as well. So we will be doing the valve springs next, but what I'm going to do is take down note of every one of these. Notice, like I said, I have this organizer, so we know exactly what came out of where. Be sure all these stay in the order they came out. And this one is a 362, so we're going to write all of these down per the numbers that are inside of them. This is a 342. I'm going to write them all down in my spreadsheet. That way, when we install the new cams and check measurements, we'll be able to just be ahead on the mathematics of what buckets we have to change to. Over there on shelf, I have literally thousands of these in various sizes, so we don't have to wait around. But I'm just gonna clean up again because removing these buckets got oil everywhere, and I will demonstrate how we do the valve spring. I want to show how I got this hooked up. So I have my shop air over here, 120 psi coming in, hooked up to the lead off of the leak down tester. So that's just putting pressure in here. The crankshaft will rotate when you do this, so make sure you're not in gear and you don't have anything attached to the crankshaft because it will spin it. So we are no longer at mid plane, we are now at BDC because the air pressure pushed it all the way down. So I've hooked up the Lyle tool. This is the tool by Lyle, the valve spring compressor tool. There are many configurations you can do with this, so I just set it up like this for the convenience of doing this in engine bay. So I have these are actually OEM bolts for cam caps, and then I just put 2 nuts under them in order to take up the length of them, and then I just have it set up to where this is nice and firm here, and I figured out a length of this in order to be able to push down on the valve spring. So what we're going to do is we take our magnet and we're going to stick the magnet down in here while pushing down on the valve spring and get it out. So let me see if I can do this on video. So we're just going to push down, and we're going to grab those retainers. So you see I got both of the retainers. We're going to lift up gently, get this out of the way, and now we have a valve spring. So this is how you would replace out your valve seals if you did need to do that. So this is the upper retainer. I'm going to stick this guy down into there. Do not push down on the valve. If it falls in, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Okay, so I'd like to show up close sort of how we get this in here. I'm going to use my needle noses. Our objective is to get them to sit right on there in the correct direction, of course. My needle noses are a little bit magnetized, so that could create a problem. Oh, that one fell right into place. I could only get so lucky. So we're going to use this pick. It's not magnetized, and we're going to try to get this thing to sit down and fall into position over there. And having a slight intersection problem between the two. There we go. And you just pull this away, and nice and seated. And you can see which one we did because that one is now white. So now this will have to be relocated to do a couple of them like these two, and of course the opposite side, but at least we have a configuration that we know works. Like I said, this can be relocated in many different positions and configurations to suit whatever you want to do. So I'm going to at least knock out these 4 and probably these 4 in this position, and then I'll relocate these and knock out the other 8. Another method. So that's the harder method of installing it, right? You drop the parts in after you have it in place. In this case, what I've done is you can drop the spring in, you can put the keepers on top, and then they're already mostly in place. And then when you drop this down, they almost fall into place. I will have to guide them a little bit, but like, they are almost exactly where they should be. It didn't go as smooth on this one, but I've already knocked out a couple of them this way. All right, we got all the valve springs installed. I got all the tools out of the way, wiped up. So now what we have to do is, these are a smaller base circle cam, so they come with lash caps. So these little lash caps need to be put on top of each one of these valve stems, and once you have all those on, then you put all the buckets on top of them. Now the buckets haven't changed order. I've written them down. What we're going to do is we're going to assemble everything, spin the cams over, and then we're going to write down all of our tolerances. We're going to check all of our lash on each one of the cams. So once we're sure all of those numbers are good, we can just finish installation, go ahead and do the timing. But chances are you're going to have to change at least a couple of buckets. We do sell them on our website as well, but you know, you want to make sure that all your cams are within spec, so you don't prematurely wear down your cam lobes, or so you don't have a valve that's just stuck open all the time. Important note before we go tightening these cams down, remember, when we injected air into these cylinders, it moved back down to TDC on at least 2 of the cylinders. So that's at BDC, but that's at TDC. So I can't go tightening these cams down with it sitting at TDC on any cylinders. So we need to return this thing back to a 90 BDC ideally. So what I'm going to do is, we are currently 180 ATDC or BTDC, doesn't matter, because without cams there is there's only 360 degrees here. So what we're going to do is, I've installed the old crank bolt in there. We're just going to take a wrench real quick. We're just going to rotate this thing 90 degrees. So objectively, we shouldn't be able to tighten this just by rotating it a little bit. So I should be able to just pop this back off. There we go. So a little bit more for grins. Yeah, I'm satisfied with that. So we'll go ahead and go through with doing the cam tightening now, and then we can start with the spinning them over. So we will be putting grease. The ARP Ultra, wait, why is that in there? That's fastener lubricant. Usually these came with an actual assembly grease. Well, we'll be using an assembly grease, not the ARP bolt grease. We'll be putting an assembly grease on all of the cam lobes as well as on the bearing surfaces to make sure that this spins over without much effort. The proper racing grease, that's racing assembly grease. So a proper assembly grease, we put it all over the cam lobes and all over those bearings. Like I said, I have put down all of the cam caps and went back and torqued them. Be sure you torque them. If you over torque them, then you can mess with the shape of the bearing and then mess with all of how everything goes together. Okay, so next thing, I'm going to grab my, I have some dummy bolts that I put in the front of this. They're not the bolts we're assembling the motor with. You just put the bolts in the front so we can spin the motor over, or spin just the cams over. Since we are verified at not TDC, at mid-plane as I call it, as some people call it, we're going to spin these over 10 times each, 10 rotations, and then we're going to check all of our torque again as well. If all the torque is good, then we're just going to go ahead and start getting in there with the feeler gauges and measuring everything down on all the measurements down. I figured I'd go ahead and demonstrate how I'm taking these. So let's see, I'm doing the first 2 lobes here on the intake side, and these Well, we're not gonna worry about where they should be because right now we're just trying to see where they are. So we're gonna start with a 7 thousandths, and definite, easy fit. Move over to the 8. And the 8, easy fit, easy fit. Okay, and grab the 9. If we can, this is a, there we go. 9 fits. 9 is a tight fit. So there we go. And that one's probably going to be a 9 because when we move to 10, we're not going to be able to get a 10 on the second load. Nope, we can't. This one, still no problem. So we're going to move up to 11. Oh boy. All right, 11. 11's a tight fit, so that means if we put a 12 on there, it's probably not going to fit at all. 12, no dice. 12 does not happen, so that's going to be 11, and I believe I just said 9 or 10. All right, we're over here at the desk with all of the numbers. So I measured all of these out. Those are all the bucket sizes on the exhaust side and intake side, and then we're entering those into here. So I've set my calculator up to where all you have to do is enter the values in exactly off the sheet as you write them down. So entered all of those into here. These are the initial values in inches. We're not using lash caps as our means of changing tolerance. So I just put zeros in these 4 columns. And then the bucket size, again, the numbers we took off the back of the buckets, those just fill in here. What we're going to be doing is trying to enter bucket numbers into here in order to turn these numbers into the idealized numbers. Factory specs and most of the cams we've installed say that you need to have 10 to 12 thousandths on the exhaust, and oh, I have this entered in here wrong. The exhaust is usually the larger tolerance of 10 to 12 thou, and the intake is usually 8 to 10 thou. So I need to swap those numbers real quick. But the Esslinger specs are 2 thousandths tighter than factory. They are aftermarket cams. So we're going to be running those at 6 to 8 thousandths on the intake and 8 to 10 thousandths on the exhaust side. Down here I have a list of all the buckets and our inventory quantities. And so what I'm just going to be doing here is modifying these numbers here to try and get these numbers to match the ideal spec. Okay, we finished up all the values, so I'm going to go through and see which buckets we can keep, which ones we need to change, which ones we can reuse in other positions, and what I need to pull off a shelf. So these are going to be our end numbers. What I've done is I've prioritized getting all of these in the 90 10 thousandths, well, in the 9 thousandths region, because this you're supposed to aim high on exhaust and aim low on intake. So we want to get closer to 6 thou and on this one, and closer to 10 thou on this one. So I aimed into the 9s, and I aimed sort of getting these down into the 7s just because I know my availability on buckets. So getting this thing down to 6 would be a little bit more difficult with the bucket selection. So yeah, we're gonna just resume with changing out all the buckets off of this and rechecking all these values. If they're all good after that, then we're good for reinstall. I should have just had the camera on my head this whole time. That'll make life easier. So now I need to show what I've gotten done. I've changed out all of the buckets. These are all the correct ones now. I've cleaned off the front of the engine all the way down to the bottom. Got all the RTV off of there. What I do is I have one of these spinny wheel things. Let's see, this guy. Don't use that one. That's not the one I used. I used one of these softer ones. I used that to get to everything that I could, and after that I used a Dremel tool with a, well, I obliterated the one I had. Oh, one of these mini wire brushes. Those will get you into everything else. And I also took the front cover, put it in the parts washer, got rid of the massive amount of oil staining. It's pretty much, the whole front cover was black, like this little spot right here. From the multiple leaks. So it's going to get a new front seal as well as a VBT seal and a valve cover gasket, of course. So the next step we're going to have is we're going to start putting this thing into the position for timing it. Now we're going to do this now before we put the front cover on. The front cover can't go on until the cams are installed and torqued. We're going to line up the slots in the back of these cams with our timing tool here. So let's go ahead and take care of this. All I'm going to do is I'm going to sit this on the flap on the back here, and I'm going to rotate this cam until we come up to the position where it should slot in. And either that's the slot or we're 180 out. We may be 180 out. Let me grab this one and attempt to get that one to line up. This one should be coming right up to position here. This should be it. There we go. That one's slotted right in. Let's try this one again. Back it up a little bit. Oh, I can't back it up because the bolt only goes one way. I'll just roll it over one more. Oh, there's my issue. Time to do it the hard way. There we go. So now that those guys are in there, the cams are in the correct position for TDC. I'm gonna go ahead and take off my dummy bolts, get those out of here. We don't need them anymore. And those I'll put off this side. Let's get a couple of things prepared here. Oh, I should put this guy back on. Now, these 3 bolts right here are torqued to the same as the rest of them, so I torqued all of those to the same value. Let's see. Next, we need to go ahead and arm the grenade, the tensioning piece. So what I do for this is, watch out, this will squirt out oil. That's why I put this in a bin with a paper towel. So we're gonna put this on here just like this, because if you do it like this, it's not gonna work, and you'll see why. So you see I grabbed on that lip right there. So we want this all the way, well, be careful, it's oily. Glad I caught that on camera, that's fun. Stuff happens. Yeah, there we go, squirting oil out. So what you're gonna wanna do is push down on this tab, and there's a little tooth in here, lift up on the tooth, push this all the way in, and then this guy goes in there and we just release. Your grenade is armed. There's your timing tensioner. You know, you're not doing a timing job right if you don't get oil everywhere. Well, at least the RX-8 has oil, that's good. It's gonna need it. So we're gonna put the crank at TDC now. Grab your timing tool, your, again, massive speed. So we have our D, this is Duratec, the other one's a Z-Tech. Just for grins, I'll show the difference. It's the short one. Don't use that one, you're gonna have a bad time. So I'm gonna reach into the Oblivion, and there is a, let's see if I can circle that bolt, if I can see it. So I've already loosened this earlier. The timing pin is on the side of the motor over here. It's usually a 10mm. You're gonna get that guy out of there. And this is gonna go in its place. And what, if we get the light in the correct position, is we can actually see the purple thing being inserted there. If we can, I hope we can see this on camera. So the purple thing gets inserted there, and then once it stops, there's no need to torque this. This should just stop. Okay, now with that in place, what's gonna happen is the counterweight of the crankshaft will bump into it. So what we're gonna do here, once again, I'm gonna grab my 21. Very gently spin this motor until we hear it bump up against that. Here, we heard that? That is a firm stop of the crankshaft. So I'm gonna pop this off of here. We are no longer in need of this old crank bolt. You actually could use the new crank bolt if you wanted for this, because it's not being yielded just yet. I just haven't even unpackaged the new one yet, so this one is now garbage. So we need to verify that our crank is touching the stopper. Let's see. I'm gonna grab my mirror so we can see really well. So as we can see there, it's touching. So the crank's in the correct position. Also, when we go to tighten it, it will have the opportunity to move forward. If we start tightening it, it will attempt to move it before we actually enter in the torque sequence, but that is why we use the counter, this counter tool, to stop it from rotating. So what we should do next is we should clean off the face of this right here. We want to make sure that everything on the crankshaft is as clean as possible, as everything on the camshafts as well, because all these mating surfaces need to be torqued down to these friction washers, and the word friction, that doesn't go very well with oil. So any oil that we have on here is going to ruin our timing job. So I'm going to be very careful as to making sure my gloves are clean, making sure these stay clean when they're unbagged, and we're going to install those on the crankshaft. So like this is the crank gear. That surface is very clean. All right, we're gonna make sure this surface is very, very clean. If you're super paranoid, get out your alcohol wipes. Okay. I'll just stand that up so it stays clean. And we're going to do, where is it? So we have our timing chain here, and we have, there we go. Okay, so what's gonna need to happen is we're gonna need to drop that chain in there and put the tensioner in. That's gonna be a bit of a tricky thing. Let's see if I can do this on camera. Okay, so being very careful not to touch the face, just in case there's anything on my hands. We're gonna guide this on here. Cool, that's on. We already wiped off the face of the crank. We're gonna get this chain down in there. We're gonna roll this on. So I'm gonna grab it on the underside here. Let's see if we can get it onto the teeth, and then let's give it a Bob's your uncle. There we go. Awesome, it's on there. Once again, being paranoid here, wipe everything off possible. So the tensioner is going to sit on top of there. If you watch my other video, it's a lot clearer on how this is done. But the tensioner, this part installs pretty easily. It's just this right here has to be captured by this bolt. So you install this bolt first, and what I like to do is after this bolt's installed, I'll hook this under here and then push this into position, and I'll zap that on. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop this in here. It goes to the right-ish. Let's see, I'm gonna feel for the hole. It's nice to have assembled lots of these motors before, so you can remember where everything is, because visual cues are not gonna be as easy. I'm gonna take my baby 8mm here. We're tighten it. Come on, baby, 8mm, tight. Okay, that's tight. So now we're gonna fight this onto there. For this, I'm gonna grab my electric right angle and a shorty 8. That way when I get it into position, I can just give it the zap. Where'd my flashlight go? Oh, I put my flashlight up there. Let's grab this flashlight. This might be easier. Camshafts are made of steel, right? Because magnets. Okay, so we're gonna see about grabbing that under there. Play nice. Play nice. There we go. Okay. So now that's in there. Make sure you're in the correct direction. Good. Beautiful. Awesome. Tensioner in place. The wire is under it. I mean, the little spring tensioner is under it, so that's good. Awesome. Now we can worry about the cams. So cams, same story. I'm gonna make sure that the face of these things is flawless. And then we're gonna do the same thing with the actual gears. The gears are covered in oil because, of course, when I disassembled, everything got oil everywhere. So make sure we get as much oil off of these as possible. This is a friction surface. This one has oil in it, so this one might give you a lot more oil than you expect. It looks like it already let out a lot of oil in the little bin here. All right, looks like it's clean finally. I would like to install this. This is the slider that goes on the right side. It's just a timing guide. So that goes there. It's just the 2/8. I'll zip those on real quick. I put it up again. Good, I left the 8 on it. Okay, that works for me. Let's get the cam bolts out. Cam bolt 1. Cam bolt 2. Cam washer 1. So what we're going to do with this cam washer here is I'm going to go ahead and insert this here. I'm just going to go ahead and pop this onto here. Okay, that's good. Let's see, where's my other one? Here you are. I'm throwing these on the floor so I don't go digging through a pile of things I don't need. So we're going to throw the bolt through the face, flip it over, and same thing, I'm just going to push that on there a little bit. All right. You go on the left side, because the exhaust does not have VVT. Okay, keep it on there loose enough that we can move it around. So now we're going to drop the chain on. Chain goes around there, around here, and around there. So what you'll notice is the chain is not even in time now because everything's free still. So what we're going to do is we have to put in, it just has oil everywhere. This guy slides on a little bit this way and then up into position there. So once you push it all the way on, it'll only back off that far. And then we need to stick in the grenade. It sits right here. What I like to do is install one bolt and then slide it up into position because it'll rotate into position. So we went ahead and released the tensioner. So now the cams can be locked into time. So notice how everything goes together. The chain is seated on the bottom of this. The chain is tight against these. The other chain is on. That looks pretty good for me. All right, I went and had myself some water. Did a little bit of cleaning up around here. Less stuff on the table. I knocked in the front main seal, and I got out my timing tools. So we have a we're set to 30 foot-pounds. We're going to torque both of those to 30 foot-pounds, and then this is the next part. We have to degree those 60 degrees. So we got this guy, and then we're going to grab out the other timing tool. We're going to grab the big one to make our life even easier. Although 30 foot-pounds is not exactly a lot. The important thing here is that we are countering ourselves. If you are not comfortable with countering yourself, let someone else do it. Don't have someone else counter for you either, because the whole idea is that you're pushing and pulling with the same amount, so this thing can keep you in position, but it's not strong enough to counter you. If you don't know what I'm talking about, this job is not for you. Because if you screw this up, then you either have to buy new cams or, well, a new motor. Okay, nice and easy. Cool, nice and easy. So that's that portion. Make sure you set your torque wrench back to the minimum. Cool, back in the drawer, set that there. Oh, I'm actually gonna need that. No, you know, we're gonna use the bigger wrench because I like to make my life easier with this guy. Okay, so 60 degrees. If you divide 360 by 6, then you end up having 60 degrees there. So we're gonna put a mark here, a mark there. So I'm putting a mark on this tip and then on the position where the next tip is, because that will be exactly 60 degrees of rotation. Now, bonus content, if you make your mark big enough, what you can do is, oh, no, it is big enough, yeah. So what I'll do is I'm actually going to mark where this is. So this is right here. So if I just put a dot there, then we can end up degreeing this over. Looks like I'm off just a little bit because of the play. So we'll just go a little past. Okay. We're gonna do this one first. Nice and easy. Like I said, a little bit past. A little bit more. Cool. On to this one. Beautiful. Degreed. So we're gonna end up doing the same thing on the crankshaft. It's just much easier to see it on the camshafts. Now that the camshafts are installed, now that all of that stuff is done, we're actually ready to put the front cover on. Now, I've cleaned off all my bolts. They're nice and shiny now, no more RTV on them. They'll go in nicely, well, unless there's crap in the threads. So I got this wiring harness I put over the top. I moved the power steering hose under here. This is gonna be the only other hose that's gonna be a problem. We need to try and slide this down in here. I slide it in over here usually, and then over, because that timing cover aims way over that way. We don't wanna get any RTV on this. Obviously not on the cams either. So we're gonna go ahead and apply RTV to this now. All right, we've RTV'd this thing up. Let's drop it in. So this part, like I said, it is tricky. We wanna drop it in nice and carefully. Make sure we don't touch anything. Get over to the side, line up the crank bolt, and there we are. So I'm going to throw in the 3 main big bolts. And then the one other large bolt, that one goes down in the bottom right, just where it came out from. And the other one that we need to make note of is there is one bolt in here that's longer than the others. That one. He goes right there. So we're gonna go ahead and get these close to cinched down. And then I'm just gonna let this dry overnight. Back at it again this morning. I went ahead and tightened down all the bolts that hold on the front cover. I went through them a couple of times just to make sure that everything was cinched down nice and tight. And I also took a Q-tip and I ran it inside of here to make sure that the face on the front of the crank is clean. I'm gonna check my gloves, make sure those are clean, because we're about to put on the crank pulley. Now the crank pulley, we wanna make sure that this surface is very clean, because this is the friction surface that it needs to go up against it. I'm gonna clean inside of it just to make sure no oil can come out of it. Clean the outside, inside, and the front side. Cool. Important note, this is the correct part number for this, LF9470228J. It's an OEM Mazda. If you don't have one of these, get one. And there's, yeah, the other indicator says LF94. Only use OEMs for these, at least until ATI or Fluid Damper comes out with one. I've replaced out the VBT seal on this already. We're gonna put on the valve cover gasket right before we drop it in. All right, so we're going to get ready to install this guy. We're gonna take out our washer. Okay, I have my washer. I'm gonna put this in here. Okay, now I want to point out, let me grab my flashlight. I would like to point out that on the underside there, we have a bolt hole that is an M6x1. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using an M6x1 to line that hole up with that hole. That's our indicator position to make sure this is in the correct orientation. That way, when we go to put on the crank sensor, it lines up with the correct tooth. If you do put this in the correct position, there should just be enough play in the crank position sensor to get it lined up with the correct tooth, which should be, if I remember, it's tooth number 5. But either way, we're gonna go and drop this in. So we get it down in there, and we just wiggle it on there. Ta-da. I'm gonna go get my hands on a spare bolt. Do I have a spare bolt in here? I have my spare bolt, just a regular M6x1. It's actually another timing cover bolt from I guess one of the teardowns we did. So we're gonna put this into here, and it should be a little off the side. There we are. This will have a little bit of play to it, you can see. That is okay. So if you get a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, not a big deal. Main thing is you don't want to shear this guy off. If you attempt to torque against this, you're going to damage the front cover, the timing pin, and probably the timing plate back there. Okay, so we got that screwed in. Cool, that's not going anywhere. I'm just verifying I got all my bolts in there. Yeah, the only one missing is going to be when we get this guy. And I'm going to put that on after we do the torque sequence. Okay, we're ready to throw our bolts in. We're going to install our tool. This time it's going to be used in the opposite orientation. Or it's going to be countering the other direction. So we're going to put that in there. Since we are going to be turning right, this will be countering left. So this position will work, unless I can get it over here. Doesn't look like I have enough room. That's why I say this is way easier outside of car, of course. But you can do it in car, just sucks. Okay, that'll hold there. And we need to get a torque wrench. Cool. That was 76 foot-pounds. Now, the next thing we're going to have to do is the torque angle. So just like we did on the cam bolts, we have to do that on the crank bolt, but the crank is 90 degrees. So I'm going to mark that one as obviously as I can from up here. Let's see. I'm going to take that right there. I'm going to mark that right there. So that's kind of in the middle of this flat. And then this bump. So we should be able to get just about that. Now, as stated before, since we got our 76 done, I'm going to pull all of the timing stuff out. Everything that holds it into time is now going to come out. So first we're going to pull out the timing pin. Okay, got our retainer 8 out. Now we need to get that out of the back. This could be tight. It's a little tight on the intake. Let's wiggle it out of the exhaust. Cool. So all that's out. Now that all that's out, we're actually free. If at this point you want to check your timing, this is a good time. You can rotate the motor over, and then you can try to put all your timing tools back in and see that everything lines up where it should. All right, we're going to go ahead and get to torquing this. So I no longer need this. This actually does have the ability to do degrees, but the problem is you would have to assume that the thing that you are torquing does not move at all. And unfortunately, if our crankshaft moves, then the degree value is worthless. Due to our visibility, we're just going to do this sort of incrementally. That's usually how I do these. I stick this down in here, I torque a bunch, or I rotate it a bunch, and then we just check it to see if I've moved far enough. And that should be it. Cool, that works for me. We have our 90 degrees. Let's see, so we're done with this and this. A beautiful selection of high-vis snap-on wrenches here. Cool, that mark will stay there as proof that I timed the motor. So what we need to do is put this back in. Please make sure you tighten this. If you don't tighten it and it falls out later, you'll lose your oil. You know what, let's not even worry about the water pump for the moment, because you all know how to reassemble everything, I hope. Let's worry about lining up that crank pulley sensor. So, we're gonna get down there with our mirror, and we're gonna look. So you see you got your two bolt holes, you got that guy and that guy, and then you can see the teeth on the crank. I mean, you can see them from up here, but it's easier to see from there. So we should be down on tooth number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's like 5 or 6. And then we also want to verify that this is still at the correct TDC position. So that looks like it is at the correct position. First, your two short bolts and the crank sensor. Make sure the crank sensor, the body points rearward. I got both of these bolts down to finger tight. Yeah, now it's got a little bit of resistance to move. We're gonna get our light on there. Okay. And all we're trying to do is make sure that the sensor lines up right on the tooth. So if you can see this, it moves up and down, and we want to get it centered. So I apologize, your perspective is probably not the greatest at the moment. There we go, that should show exactly where we are. That's where we need to be, dead center of that. So it's good where it's at. Let me lock those down. Cool, spot on. So this is that squared away. Now we're just reassembling. So I'm just gonna cut over this next portion, but we're going to reinstall the tensioner, the pulley, the belt, the power steering pump, the belt, the valve cover, spark plugs, and all this nonsense that I skipped over in the beginning of the video because, well, the timing's the difficult part of this, not removing the hood and removing all of that stuff. All right, I've reassembled everything except for the hood at this point. I'm not gonna put the hood back on just yet, but what we will do is we'll load up our tune. That way this thing's not stumbling all over the place when I try to fire it back up. Tuning is just completed. Let's go ahead and give it a test fire.